Welcome back. So this is part two. As we just kind of discussed addiction. If somebody is joining us just for this one, would certainly encourage you to go back and listen to part one as we kind of move forward. Again, James Boone, internal medicine, addiction medicine doc, lover of Jesus, who have the privilege of being a part of Friendswood Baptist Church and getting to share this with both those people as well as anybody else that's interested. So, just for a brief, I gave the spiritual foundation of kind of who I am last time, and then now we're moving into really just a couple of weeks, maybe specifically just sort of very from a non-spiritual standpoint, really into the neurobiology as far as how the brain works and how those chemicals of addiction work. And when I say sort of from a non-spiritual standpoint, it's just in reality, I think everything's intertwined, right? That we are created in the image of God, that we have this amazing design, this amazing brain, the complexity of which we're really just now exploring. In reality, for me, all of it is just sort of screams out the existence of a creator because of its complexity and its beauty. So we had talked about yesterday that the outside part of the brain is where all high-level function happens, coordination, vision, balance, motor, sensory, and that nothing key for survival lives in that part of the brain. And then in the middle part of the brain, where you can see the yellow memory section, and then specifically the reward pathway, that's where addiction lives. And in the reward pathway, right, brain cells communicate electrically, but when brain cells communicate one to another from the nerve terminal in the bottom of that little picture, that's where these neurotransmitters come in. And then we talked about how that was supposed to work, and that the neurotransmitter that is involved in the reward pathway, where we experience pleasure and reward, is the chemical dopamine. We mentioned some numbers about food, 100% increase in dopamine, sex around 150% increase in dopamine, and that's peak natural, and how key both of those are for survival, both my survival or procreation and survival of the species. And then we also talked about the fact that even simple pleasures, things that I enjoy, it's a gorgeous day in Friendswood today, and those things that give me pleasure, that those things are actually drivers of human function. We talked a little bit very briefly that also in that part of my brain is the opiate receptor. Crazy, right? That why in the world do we have an opiate receptor? That in the pleasure center of my brain, I have something that specifically responds to heroin, to oxycodone, to Dilaudid, to hydrocodone, a popular plant-based product now called kratom that is opioid-like, that these receptors respond to that. And also a THC receptor, a cannabis, marijuana specific receptor in my brain. And why am I built with that? And what does that look like? Which we'll cover a little bit later. Now, that we talked about that it's dopamine that actually makes me say I like it, but it's what dopamine does to the receptor itself. So after dopamine gets on this receptor, the dopamine receptor, dopamine stimulates that receptor, and that's when I actually can experience that sensation of pleasure. So it's not just dopamine, and that'll be important a little bit later as we further kind of understand this process. So it's not just 100% increase or 150% increase in dopamine. For me to experience pleasure, euphoria, delight, for me to experience that is mediated by what this receptor does. So in this schematic, where this receptor is activated and then produces the chemical response, is basically that makes me say I like it. So that's how the system is supposed to work, and that gives me brain cell to brain cell communication. Now, until really the 1950s, 1960s, the leading concept on addiction was really for probably what still most of the world thinks, which basically was, you need to stop doing that. You're destroying your life, you're destroying families, you're destroying relationships. Like just please stop, right? Just, do you recognize the pain that this is causing? Please stop. And then really a game-changing sort of animal study that was huge in the foundation of addiction medicine. And it was an animal study. And the study was very simplistic. So basically what they did is they put a mouse in a cage. Now animals explore perimeters. So if there's anybody who's a rancher or who's been on a ranch, you have to check your fence lines, right? Because animals explore perimeters. If you've ever gone to a zoo, animals will pace and you'll see them explore the perimeter of the cage. And so animals explore perimeters. So they did this very simplistic, very simple study. So they put food and water on one side of the cage. And on the other side of the cage, there was a low, wide bar. So that bar was low enough and wide enough that as the mouse explores the perimeter, the mouse doesn't jump it or walk around it. Every time the mouse walks around, he steps on that bar. They hook the bar up to a pump. They hook the pump up to an IV. So now this mouse has an intravenous catheter going into a large bore vein, hanging on a swivel at the top of the cage, which gives the mouse freedom of access of the cage. So now every time as the mouse walks around and steps on that bar, he gets an intravenous dose of whatever we put in that IV bag. So really, it's an incredibly simple, almost high school-like experiment, right? I mean, it was so simplistic. What was so fascinating was then if you put anything into that IV bag that humans have never abused in any fashion, so let's put IV antibiotics in there, let's put blood pressure medicines in there, put diabetes medicines in there, put any other chemical in there that doesn't have what we would consider abuse potential. And what you see is that mouse just live mouse life in a box, right? He just walks around and does mouse stuff in a box, right? But change it up, right? So let's put alcohol in there. Alcohol. Now, every time this mouse explores the perimeter and steps on that bar, that mouse gets an intravenous and IV infusion of alcohol. Within just a few days, right? This mouse acts like a lot of my patients who struggle with alcohol use disorder, and just this mouse just loves to hang out at the bar. Right? I mean, he gets drunk. He walks over and gets a snack. He gets a little drink of water, and the mouse goes back over, and the animal spends all its time right at that bar taking an intravenous alcohol. Right? This is a mouse. Right? Let's put an opiate in here. Let's put morphine, Demerol, Dilaudid, heroin. Put any type of opioid in that IV bag. That mouse stays over there. That mouse gets high on opiates. They spend a little bit less time eating. There's a little bit of weight loss, and they spend all their time getting high on opiates. Let's put some marijuana in there, cannabis in there. These mice spend an inordinate amount of time taking in IV cannabinoids. They eat a little bit more, they snack a little bit more, they nap a little bit more, and you have these little sleepy, snacky, lazy mice sitting here taking in marijuana, right? Let's put cocaine or methamphetamine, extremely potent drugs that work on the reward pathway. Let's put those in that IV bag, and what happens? That mouse stays over there. That mouse gets dependent on that drug. That mouse stays at the bar, stimulating IV cocaine, IV methamphetamine, hours and hours and hours, eventually exhausted, falls asleep at the foot of the bar, awakens, IV methamphetamine or IV cocaine, hours and hours, eventually exhausted. In the initial study, it was an 18-inch walk to the food and water source, and these mice died of dehydration and starvation. They didn't walk 18 inches for food and water. In the animal model, we know from a survival standpoint that the food and thirst instinct, the food and water instinct, are some of the most powerful animal survival instincts that we know of, right? This was completely unexpected by the researchers, right? This was this doesn't make this doesn't make any sense, right? This is like, what in the world, right? I mean, like, walk 18 inches away, eat, drink, go back. I mean, this was sort of shocking information. And sometimes when I present this to my patient population, somebody might raise their hand and go, "Hey, Dr. Boone, I used IV methamphetamine. I still got something to eat or drink," right? And I'm like, I know I'm thankful that you're smarter than a mouse, right? But you still lost 35 pounds. You still used where somebody got shot in a drug deal gone bad. You still use in spite losing a marriage, losing a relationship. Like this still, it doesn't make sense, right? Now, this study was really hallmark in addiction medicine on several different levels. Number one is that it was the first time that we could objectively identify drugs that were behavior changing, or in sort of animal terminology, reinforcing in simple terms for me, as simple terms, medicines that were addictive. So if I take medicines, for example, that we use for depression or anxiety disorders, like the SSRIs, the serotonin medications like Prozac or Lexapro or citalopram or Paxil or Wellbutrin, or if I put those medicines in that IV bag, right, that animal doesn't get dependent on that. It doesn't continue to use those things inordinately. So it allowed us objectively to look at drugs and basically to go, hey, this drug has an addictive or abuse potential. And exactly what we saw in the mouse model is what we saw in the human model, essentially across the animal spectrum. When it comes from a mammal standpoint, we saw this reinforcing slash addictive behavior take place. So number one, it allowed us to objectively identify, and it's exactly what we had seen in our human group. The second thing I've already alluded to, the second part was specifically with cocaine and methamphetamine, where it superseded the survival instinct, right? We had a drought in the hill country, I don't know, 8-9 years ago. It was a desert out there. It didn't rain for months, right? And animals were, smelling water in people's swimming pools in their backyard, crawling under fences, smelling water from miles away, right? The nicest dog in the world, starve that animal. They'll kill for food. They'll claw through sheetrock to get to food, right? And the fact that this drug superseded the survival instinct on thirst and food was also just sort of a crazy thing, that in some of the AA terminology, the insanity, right? The insanity. When you see people give things up that if you ask them, this is infinitely more important. My wife, my children, my job, my career, my education, infinitely more important than this hydrocodone tablet, than this line of cocaine, than this. And yet we saw this behavior that was just quote unquote crazy or insane. The last thing, and this was very profound for me, and the last thing for me that was very profound was that this was the first time that it separated from the moral equation, right? Because we think about a mouse and we're not thinking about you need, good mouse friends, or if there was such a thing as mouse church. And I say that facetiously, right? But I'm serious at the same time. And yes, I strongly believe that as humans, we're created in the image of God, that our ability to have impulse control and to have judgment and reasoning. I'm not equating us to a mouse from a spiritual standpoint. But the flip part is that the design, right? God's design, the way he built us, we are built with this incredible and beautiful design, but there also was the fall. And so with the fall, there are things that are broken, and there are ways that we act. There are things that we do that we can still learn an incredible amount from the animal model. So that was very profound to me, that there was something neurologic, something neurobiochemically, that the area that this appeared to happen was in this sort of deep-seated primitive area, right? So let me move a little bit forward, and I'm going to briefly mention some of you in the audience that might have read a little bit about some of these animal studies. There was another study that came out, and they talked about that this study was fundamentally flawed because you had a mouse in isolation, right? And most animals are also social creatures, right? Think about flocks of birds, think about herds of deer, right? Think about, so from a mice standpoint, it was re-challenged, and they said this was an artificial study. And in reality, if you put a mouse into this strong, sort of perfect social network with unlimited food, with unlimited little things to play with unlimited male female sexual encounters, etc., that you didn't see all of these mice choose drug, right? So essentially, if you put the mouse into Mouse Disney World, that something is different. Now, we're certainly strong believers, and scripture tells us, right, that we need each other. We need relationship. Confess your sins one to another, to live in community. It is not good for man to be alone. I mean, clearly that's so spelled out in scripture. But in the same fashion, I don't believe that this actually takes away from the study. So in this rat park study, where you put the rat in this perfect little idyllic world, right, we we don't live in an idyllic world. We live in a broken world. And there's house fires, and there's COVID-19, and there's isolation, and there's pancreatic cancer, and there's life events that are difficult, right? So yes, I believe in the critical importance of community, the critical importance of the church, and as we talk about 12-step recovery, the critical importance of a relationship with a sponsor, the critical importance about a relationship with a counselor, the critical importance about relationship with one another and doing life together. So not taking away from any of that, but I don't believe that this study, even though it was done in isolation, loses value in some fashion. Then, as technology advanced, they started to go, so where does this happen? So instead of an intravenous catheter, as technology got better and better, we're able to implant a microcatheter that went directly into the brain of the mouse, but it delivered chemical less than a half a millimeter from the catheter tip. So we could put that tip into an exact location in the brain and see what happened, right? And so in this schematic, for example, if I put that catheter tip anywhere into that outside part of that cortex, the whole outside part of the brain, and I put heroin directly into that part of the brain, cocaine directly into that part of the brain, methamphetamine directly into that part of the brain, what does the mouse do? Nothing. The mouse ignores it and lives mouse life in a box. It wasn't until we delivered drug into the very middle part of the brain, and specifically those areas that I have highlighted in purple at the base, fancy doctor words, the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area. So when you deliver drug there, that animal became addicted to that drug, right? That animal became dependent. It changed the animal behavior. And then as technology got better, we were able to sort of explore that further. And so researchers began to explore the concept that the brain's an electrical organ. So if the brain's an electrical organ, what if we bypass drug altogether? So instead of implanting a micro catheter, let's implant a micro electrode. So they did a coated electrode that could deliver milliamperage of current from the tip of the electrode. So some of you may have seen some of those studies, deep electrical brain stimulation. If I put that electrode into my right anterior motor cortex and I press the button, I can have the human volunteer, all of a sudden their arm flexes or extends, or put it in the posterior cortex and their leg moves, right? Put it into their visual cortex, see lights, colors, auditory cortex, hear sounds, noises. But when I put it into the reward pathway, nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area. So in the mouse model, when you implanted an electrode into the reward pathway, that mouse continued to stimulate the reward pathway until they died. Quit eating, quit drinking. Uh, in humans, human studies with this, they put the patient to sleep. They drill access holes. They put a microelectrode into the reward pathway. They reverse the anesthetic. And then when they stimulate that reward pathway, those patients begin describing this incredible euphoric experience, very intense, very powerful emotional experience. All of this, again, confirming that this appears to be the location for where addiction takes place. Then technology was advancing further, and we were able to label compounds. So in this imagery, what we can see is we see the human brain, we see the schematic, and cocaine has been labeled by a compound that initially they had to study in animals. Later, we were able to do what were called neuroimaging tags that allowed us to see exactly where chemicals were actually concentrated. So if we so I'm going to talk about the stimulants for a few minutes. So the stimulants, cocaine and methamphetamine, are the classic stimulants of abuse. Unfortunately, that also includes all of the stimulants that are used for attention deficit disorder. So medications like Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta, Daytrana, the stimulants for weight loss like methylphenidate or Adipex, any of those stimulants, the stimulants for wakefulness, there's some new stimulants for wakefulness, Nuvigil, Provigil, those medications, everything in the stimulant family. If you look at where those drugs are concentrated, you can see concentration there in that purple reward pathway. And then above that, you can see that little streak of green dots above that. There's several different names of that part of the brain, but one of the terminology for that is something called the prethalamic stripe. And so in humans, right, we've known for years that there's this thing called brain mapping. And brain mapping allows us to identify exactly what part of the brain controls what. So in week one, I briefly touched that the cerebellar cortex right there at the bottom, that's where we know controls balance and coordination. And the visual cortex in the back of our occiput is how we process visual information. So as they started studying these drugs and the location, they saw this intense pickup in this part of the brain called the prethalamic stripe. And the initial brain mapping data on that was not really good, and it got better and better, and they were able to determine that this part of the brain is critical for mindless repetitive activity. So an example of that, when I tie a tie, I can't tie a tie on my sons. Like I can't go in front of my sons and tie that. I have to get behind them, and I have to let my hands know what to do if I'm behind them, right? Mindless repetitive activity. When I walk, when anybody walked today, nobody was thinking, how do I walk? Nobody was thinking about right foot, left foot, right? Nobody walked and went, I keep forgetting to do that left foot thing and stumble. You don't do that, right? When you ate, you weren't going, I forgot to open my mouth and stab yourself in the face. You don't do that, right? So, but that you can stop or start walking, eating, all of those things, but it's actually that part of our brain that controls that mindless repetitive activity. So come to find out that actually every drug of addiction, from cannabis to the anti-anxiety medicines like Xanax, Valium, the opioids, alcohol, all of those drugs are also concentrated in the prethalamic stripe and actually stimulate mindless repetitive activity. So for example, with cocaine and methamphetamine, you can see repetitive behaviors, picking at the skin, picking at the face, paranoid behaviors, looking through the blinds, but also contributes to that mindless default mechanism. My alcohol, right? The first thing, next thing you know, you're pulling off to go to the liquor store. You're pulling off to the alcohol aisle. You're not thinking, this subconscious, mindless, repetitive activity across the board stimulated, but that by itself is not enough to cause addiction. So in the animal model, it was so profound with that stimulation, they went back into the mice and went, okay, so what if we just put cocaine there? Doesn't do it. the animal. So it contributes to mindless repetitive activity across the spectrum, but we see this concentration in the reward pathway. Now, if you look in the schematic, right, you don't see it up in the cerebellum where balance and coordination is controlled. So people who are abusing stimulants, they don't become intoxicated with slurry speech and stumbling gait and what we consider that kind of drunk body loss of coordination. They don't have that, right? No receptors in there. There's no receptors. They don't get slurry speech. They don't have that, right? So very specific part of the brain. Now, remember how this is supposed to work. So here's that nerve terminal in the reward pathway. So dopamine is stored in these little sacs called vacuoles. Something stimulates my reward center. That vacuole merges with the cell wall, releases dopamine into the space. Dopamine activates a receptor, the blue receptor in this schematic. The blue receptor is activated. I like it. I experience that sense of pleasure. The receptor then falls off and it's taken up by a protein transport pump and it goes back up into the cell where it's going to be used again, right? That's how the system is supposed to work. We talked about some numbers, right? We talked about food, 100%. We talked about sex, 150%. Those key things from a survival standpoint. That's how it's supposed to work. Well, what happens is that cocaine comes in here, and cocaine blocks the reuptake pump. So now, dopamine stimulates a receptor, falls off. It doesn't get taken up by the protein transport pump. Activates it again, activates it again, activates it again, activates it again. Peak natural, 150% increase in dopamine. With cocaine, we have 300% increases in dopamine. 300% increases in dopamine in my reward pathway. Intravenous methamphetamine not only blocks the reuptake pump, but methamphetamine also makes that cell wall permeable. So any dopamine left in that nerve terminal, any dopamine left inside there filters through. And the methamphetamine, that compound has a very long half-life. And so unlike cocaine, which is metabolized in minutes, methamphetamine is metabolized over hours. And so you have up to 1,100% increases in dopamine in the reward pathway. 1,100% increase. This is where, in this design, this is where I experience pleasure, euphoria, right? So I am a guy that became a believer in Christ at a very early age. At age 9, I had this great wife, my dad, a missionary doctor, and great parents who loved me. I don't have any family history of addiction. No alcohol use disorder on either side of the family, no drug use disorder, no trauma in my childhood or adolescence. I've been happily married to just a great girl. I've been married to Ruth 40 years this year. And I don't see alcohol as a moral issue, but I just personally don't like it. So I don't drink anything, and never used an illicit compound, and I'm just a content guy, right? So, but now, almost 17, 18 years ago, when I'm first listening to this data being presented, I'm sitting in the audience, right? I'm sitting in the audience, and I'm just thinking, no, wait. This is my pleasure center, right? I get neurobiologically, I get that, right? And I'm thinking, so food 100%, sex 150%, and you're telling me 300% or up to 1,100%, right? And I'll just tell you, when I'm listening to that data, there's a little part of me that was sort of like, oh, sign me up. Like, sign me up for that. I mean, what would that be like? I want to, so that concept was sort of flitting through my mind, right? Until the guy went the next statement in this lecture. Because here's the deal, here's the problem. The design is that I'm built to do things a certain way. So for some of my computer people, this may not even be the right terminology, but the whole concept of like operational parameters, right? I'm using a MacBook to do this talk on, and if I was overseas and I said, hey, you know what, I'm going to plug this into a 220-volt outlet thing, it would blow up, right? It's built for 110, right? It can't take that. My eyes can only handle so much light intensity, right? We had the solar eclipse, what, 3 years ago, maybe? If I had somebody that go, hey, don't tell me what to do, I'm going to go look at it and stare at that sun. I'm like, well, you can, but you'll be blind the rest of your life. You'll kill the cells in your central retina, called the fovea retinalis, and you'll have central blindness because your eyes are not built for that light intensity. My ears aren't built for a certain intensity of noise. It damages my hearing. My heart can only go so fast before I die. My heart can only go so slow before I die, right? The old VW diesel Jetta that I put 400,000 miles on, right? If I would have gone as my car, I'm tired of paying for diesel. I'm going to put jet fuel in this. And it's going to be amazing. I'm not going to shift out of third gear. I'm going to see this thing is going to be like a rocket. No, if I put jet fuel and don't shift, that thing's going to blow up. It's built for diesel. It's built to shift at so many RPMs. I get that, right? And so the way that we're designed, the way that we're built, is that peak natural is 150%. All the drugs of addiction, depending on how often you take them in, the volume that you take those in, all of those drugs of addiction take our dopamine levels above the 150% threshold. So let's take this example on cocaine. So I have somebody that takes a little hit of cocaine, what we call a bump of cocaine. They take in a small amount of cocaine. They get this 300% surge in dopamine in their reward pathway. Now I get a 300% surge one time. Now, remember what I said, it's not dopamine that makes me say I like it, right? It's what dopamine does to those receptors. So in this little cartoon, I have 5 of those dopamine receptors. So now I get a 300% increase in dopamine. And this is a simplistic explanation, but it's helpful. Simplistically, right, my brain neuroadapts. Simplistically, I knock off a receptor. So now my brain is going, hey, that 300%, I'm not built for that. So it's not dopamine that makes me say I like it. It's what dopamine does to the receptor. So I desensitize the receptor. And again, this is simplistic. But now I take in another bump of cocaine, and only 4 of those receptors produce the chemical response that make me say I like it instead of 5. And so it wasn't quite what I remembered. And so now I take in a little bit more, and I take in a little bit more, and I take in a little bit more. And now I'm gonna smoke it and get higher concentrations if I take it in by inhalation with the form of crack cocaine or freebase cocaine. And now I'm going to inject it. I'm going to dissolve it and inject it intravenously as I try to get that. And so it's the phenomenon of tolerance. So you got a buzz the first time you had 2 beers, and then it was 3 beers, and then it was 4, and then it was 5, and then it was 6, and then it was 8. And then, hey, it's easier to get that with vodka or whiskey, and drinking lower amount of volume and not having to pee as frequently or whatever, right? And you continue to chase that. And it was 1 hydrocodone that you found in your parents' medicine cabinet, and then it was 2, and then it was 3, and then it was 4, and then it was 8. And now I'm trying to buy oxycodone, which is harder to get. And now I'm buying heroin, which is cheaper. And again, it's chasing that phenomenon, right? The phenomenon of tolerance. I get that. But what else does that mean? This is where I experience pleasure, right? This is my reward pathway. This is where I experience a sunset and a sunrise and a moonrise and seeing an axis deer in velvet and catching a redfish on a topwater and playing with my kids and my grandkids and hitting a golf ball and just flowers outside of my window right now that I'm looking at. It's where I get to feel all of that, and all of those things are less than the 150% threshold peak, right? So desensitize those pathways, and all of a sudden you lose the ability to experience the same daily pleasures and good gifts that God designed us for. And all of a sudden those things start to have less and less meaning, less and less significance, because the stimulation of my reward pathway is less and less intense. So I remember exactly where I was sitting in that audience the first time I heard this data presented. I remember that thought flipping through my head of like, wow, I wonder what that would be like. I'd love to. And then all of a sudden going, oh my goodness, no, I want a sunrise. I want to see Ruth smile and hear her laugh and play with grandkids and just get those funny little videos and see my kids and just light up and just I want to feel all of that, right? I want to enjoy a warm chocolate chip cookie. I want whatever that is. But what happens? What do we see happen in real life in people who are struggling with addiction? They start to lose the ability to enjoy those things. They lose the ability to feel those things that every good and perfect gift comes from above, right? They lose that experience and they get robbed of that as they continue to desensitize their reward pathway. Good news and bad news. The good news is that over time, you rebuild your dopaminergic receptors. So with most of the drugs of addiction, you're talking about an almost 6-month time frame before you completely restore dopamine receptors. And heavy methamphetamine users, that may not ever get all the way back to normal, but it gets very close. But it's months, maybe out to the 14-month mark, some continued improvement in dopamine receptors. And so I encourage my patients who are coming out of the battle with addiction that, hey, you have to give yourself time. You have to give yourself time for recovery. I had bilateral knee replacements, 2.5 years ago. I wasn't playing racquetball like I'm getting to do now. It hurt to move for a while, right? It took time to rebuild, time to get those joints back, time to get range of motion back, time to get quadriceps strengthening back. It takes time for your brain to recover, for a brain to heal. There's a time that it takes to stimulate for that part of the brain to get back to baseline. So to give yourself time for that recovery to take place is really an important thing. Now, the next thing that's fascinating is that we have these connections. We have these connections from our reward pathway to our prefrontal cortex. If you remember from week 1, I talked about the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of my brain that allows me to have good decision-making, judgment, reasoning. So some fascinating data came out back in 2007 that showed that drugs of addiction actually damage the neural connections between my prefrontal cortex and my reward pathway. So that's the part of my brain where I go, gosh, I would love to. I probably need to, right? So I get on the scale this morning. I'm a little bit higher than I want to be. And so then I go, we have some quiche in the refrigerator. I ate an apple. It's going to be like, I'm going to eat Whole Foods. But we have this quiche. And I'm like, and so the reward, right? I'm like, I'd love to, so it's that thing that we use to balance all the time, right? So what we found in 2007, that every drug of addiction, from alcohol to cannabis to hydrocodone to Xanax to methamphetamine, every drug of addiction actually damages the neural pathways that connect my prefrontal cortex. I always give an analogy. I was a big basketball fan. I trained at UT Southwestern and then Baylor Internal Medicine in Dallas. And I was a big Mavericks fan back in those days. And the Mavericks had a guy named Roy Tarpley who played for them. Any of the older folks in the audience may remember Tarpley, younger folks. He was Kobe Bryant good, really close maybe. He was an amazingly talented basketball player. When he came to the Dallas Mavericks, he had trouble with substances. And in the NBA, if you violate the NBA substance use policy 3 times, you actually get kicked out of the NBA. So this is in the late 80s. He is 6th man of the year when he comes to play for Dallas, which means he's the best non-starter in the NBA. He's this amazingly talented, up-and-coming young man that just looks phenomenal. It's in season. He's being drug tested. He's violated the policy twice. That year, as I recall, his salary was close to $5 million a year in the late 1980s. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money now, right? This kid had this amazing potential in season, getting drug screened, and he uses again and gets kicked out of the NBA. At that point, right, my thought was, you're the stupidest man on the planet. Who would do that? Who would do that, right? What was going on with Tarpley, right? What was going on is that he did not have normal impulse control. He had damaged neural pathways. Good news and bad news. The good news is this gets better. The bad news is it takes about 3 to 4 months. So we start to get recovery of those pathways within 90 to 120 days, which is why when people are first coming out of addiction, that first several months is a really critical time frame. There's a tradition in the recovery community with, for example, AA. There's a tradition of 90 meetings in 90 days. Not something that we see as critically important at La Hacienda at all, but just that tradition. But that tradition comes out of a recognition that in reality, you're at highest risk of relapse very early on. When you first, as you first come out, as you first pull out from your addiction with alcohol, with substances, you're at the highest risk just neurobiologically. Just like I was at the highest risk of experiencing failure if I didn't follow through with healthy physical therapy immediately after surgery, right? Immediately after surgery, after an ankle repair, you may have to be on crutches for a period of time, right? Because it's going to take time for bone healing. You're not ready to fully bear weight. And so early on, right, there's additional help that might be needed. So if you're struggling coming out of addiction, those first 90 to 120 days are critically important days. It's why, for example, when people leave La Hacienda, we may want them to look at sober living. We want them to do some additional counseling, maybe what we call an intensive outpatient program. Whatever that is, you need added support. You need added help, not because we think that your heart's not good, not because we think that God is inadequate, right? So please don't hear me say that, but God built us. He designed us. He built these incredible brains, but he also built us to be in community. He built us to ask for help. We need help, right? We can't do this. It is not good for man to be alone. So there are again neurobiological things that we can see in this, and so in that part of the brain that there is injury, but there also is recovery from that. So I've covered a lot of information, and I'm gonna close for today. We're gonna go a little bit deeper into different pathways with different substances next week. So thanks for being with me, and I hope this is going to be helpful. So let me just close us in prayer for today. Father, again, I am forever grateful for your love, forever grateful for your mercy, forever grateful for your forgiveness, for your kindness, forever grateful for eternity, Father. I just pray for every listener, Father, if they are struggling, if they have family members that are struggling, I just pray for healing. I pray for compassion. I pray for understanding. Father, I know that your design for us is that we are free, that our only dependence is on you. Father, we're designed to be dependent, but the dependency on you actually is freeing. That dependency on you is what actually gives us an internal joy, an internal peace. So, Father, I just pray for each of us that we become more and more dependent on you. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, thank you so much.